2021 Michigan Mechanical Code now directs us in Chapter 16 to the 2019 NFPA 13. And of course, we jumped 2 cycles, so that what's new is always the question, right? And I do want to encourage folks to uh, go ahead and interrupt if you have a question or whatever. It's very difficult on a Zoom meeting if all I'm doing is reading this to you to stretch it more than an hour. And for 80 slides. And while we'd all like to get on with our weekend, if I don't at least get a couple hours out here, it may not serve us like we hope. So if you don't know me, I started inspecting in 1999. I'm building and mechanical, and I have the FPSI categories. I instruct mechanical code at Lansing Community College. And latest and greatest, I'd like to brag that I finally finished the degree I started in 1983. So I've been in school about 34 years more than most doctors. Um, Goals and objectives. So we want to look at um, explore the newly adopted code and where they direct us from the NFPA 13. Discuss the authority to accept things not within this code, or when there's conflicts, and what supporting material we might use. That's an hour of rules and acts, which was the old admin, if you didn't get the memo. Technical, we're going to cover about an hour of content there, and that's the specific changes, and certainly not all of them, but some of the meatier ones. And when I say not all of them, there's a lot of very subtle changes on rack storage and things like that. That could be a couple dry hours all by itself, and a cure for insomnia at the same time. Specialty 1 hour, and that'll be specific new requirements and compliant installation and assemblies. So that's what we're trying to touch on today. If you didn't know, the NFPA 13 is the oldest continuously updated, or among the oldest continually updated codes, dating back to the late 1800s. Originally known as the Rules and Regulations of Fire Underwriters for Sprinkler Equipments, with an S, automatic and open systems. Yeah, I think NFPA 13 rolls off the tongue a lot better. Oops, pardon me for an overshot. In this presentation, we're looking at the latest and greatest. The 2021 Mechanical Code, which is what directs us to this new edition of the NFPA 13. What I want to do is cover the changes between the 2013 edition and the 2016 edition first, and there's a lot more substantive changes there in actual rules. When you jump from the 16 to the 21, there's not a lot of rule changes, but they dramatically changed the layout of the book. And I can give you kind of a little bit of a roadmap of where things are now, but that's going to be our biggest challenge, likely, if we're trying to look something up. So God bless Google for being there when we need it. And the 2019 NFPA 13, 13D, 13R were all adopted in this latest code edition. What's interesting, as always, is in the reference standards, you won't find it there. So you only find the link in chapter 16. What is in the reference standards is the 2021 NFPA 96 for commercial cooking, which is handy to have and know that it's there. But that would be another class. Oh, and just by the way, if any of you are a little bit rustier on this and don't recall the difference between the 13, the 13D, the 13R, 13 is your fully suppressed, many of your commercial buildings, your higher hazards, things like that. The 13R residential will cover our occupancies with a little bit of mixed use up to 4 stories, I believe. And the 13D is the least stringent of the books. and I was actually looking at putting a D system in a house we're rehabbing, a Victorian age house. It lets you use, the biggest difference between the D and the R is that the D lets you use your uh, potable water, your domestic water feed. So you don't have to have, a separate main. You don't need near the gallons. It's sort of designed with your hydraulic calcs, it's designed around the flow of two heads versus um, other systems. And so you can get away with very little water. It brings the cost down quite a bit. That said, it's far from free. The first bid I got was about half of our entire rehab budget. Okay, admin. Well, I guess as long as you're muted, it doesn't matter to us much if your phone's not turned down, but it's worth turning down in case you join in a discussion. Same thing with conversations out in the hall and such. Again, I'd like you to ask questions as they occur to you. It's important because you may have the same question as somebody else, and also,
Question.
Yeah, please.
There are exceptions given in the building and mechanical code for not requiring fire dampers when it's a fully suppressed building. Am I to assume then a 13R system would not be considered in that exception because it's technically not a fully suppressed building?
That's a great question. And I guess the first thing I would tell you is that I think you know me, I don't shoot from the hip much, so I'd want to do some reading on that. But and have you dug into the definition of fully suppressed building? I mean, I know what the definition is as far as the NFPA 13, but if we follow all the requirements of the 13R, is it fully suppressed in that context?
I have not dug into it, but from my understanding, I don't consider it a fully suppressed building because 13R is strictly for people to get out. It does not do any prevent property damage.
I do agree with you, but as we look at the requirements in the 13R, many of them are the same. So what are we missing? For instance, the 13R.
We're missing areas that aren't being sprinkled, like attics and areas like that.
Sure. But as far as shadowing and things like that, while we don't have a specific value offered by the 13, we have this mamby-pamby sort of that leaves it up to our judgment, I guess. But yeah, I think that's fair to say. But if we don't have a fully suppressed attic, what if it doesn't need to be? So then are we not fully suppressed just because it's an R building? I think that's going to be probably a case by case sort of conversation. But what ultimately, what did you decide on, or have you?
Well, I'm still waiting. I had a situation. The plans were submitted. Were submitted for a hotel, and the plan said it's going to be an NFPA 13 system. Well, the sprinkler contractor only did 13 on the first floor, and all the hotel suites are 13R. So I'm waiting for the architect to get back with me. I would not approve the sprinkler inspection because the building plans said it didn't say anything about 13R. It plans, the first page tells you what codes and stuff like that to use. The
Sure.
plans said NFPA 13. Well, the sprinkler contractor did not do that. He submitted the plans to the fire marshal, and unfortunately he submitted under 13R for the upper floors. So I'm waiting to hear back from the design professional, see what they say.
Yeah, I mean, that's as I said, I think it might be case by case. That And it's really going to probably put a lot on you to kind of sort out intent, because I don't think there's going to be a crystal clear answer unless you go 100% rigid.
Right, and also the problem in this building that it is combustible construction. So
Right,
it's
right.
it's not a 2B, it's more like a
Yeah, so then
5.
we're eliminating fire dampers.
Well, there's exceptions in the code
Yeah.
where you,
So we're
fire,
eliminating dampers.
because the building is fully suppressed. It states,
Yeah.
and a fully suppressed building, that's what the statement says. So the question is, the 13R considered a fully suppressed building? I might if step away and look at I have a copy of the building code and see what if it has a definition for that.
Yeah, and that's one place to look for sure. But I have a suspicion that you're going to end up having to scratch your own head on intent quite a bit.
Okay.
What when you where are the fire dampers? Are they every floor or just on the?
Well, there's exceptions that if you use a steel duct, and it's a steel duct system all the way, and it's a fully suppressed building, then you do not need fire dampers on a 1-hour fire barrier. So,
Mhm.
also in hospitals, but this is not a hospital. This is I don't know if it's even a high. It's a 4-story hotel going in.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. So the first floor, are there any residences on the first floor?
I don't believe so. I
dwelling
haven't gone far enough, but we were just doing the top floor at the time of the inspection.
I mean, that doesn't really say incidental to the R use anymore if you've got a whole floor. So I wonder, are they doing a full 13 system on the first floor, or are they still trying to stay with the R?
No, they can't do a 13R on the first floor.
Okay.
They'll have to do a 13. So,
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting question. I'd be let's get together after and I'd see where you came down, and I can do a little looking as well if you'd like someone to bounce something off on. But you know, that's one of the things that keeps these jobs interesting for 30 and 40 years is that uh, never seems like you run out of new questions,
right.
and it keeps us guessing.
Hey,
Okay.
Curtis, what do you think about that? Curtis, you there? I see your picture. Curtis is a building inspector too. That's why I was asking.
So I think you guys can hear me now, right?
Yeah, did you hear my
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, and like you said, that is a good question, and it's point by point. I think you're right on though, going back to the applicant and making them give you what they think the parameter is. Because maybe they didn't design it to be encompassed as a fully suppressed building.
Exactly, and there's you're more familiar with the building code than I am, but there's other give and takes as far as if you look at the tables, there's a different rating if the building's sprinkled where if it's not fully sprinkled.
Yeah, and remember, it's not our job to validate what they're building. You know, it's their job to prove to us that what they're doing complies.
Exactly.
So, and they try to do that, as you know, all the time. Well, you know, whatever code you tell us. Well, no, I'm not going to tell you.
Yeah.
Because if it goes to,
Well, yeah, and
if there's a problem,
agree.
they're
Let
going to
me
come back to you and go, oh no, you know, you shouldn't have thought of it that way.
Yeah.
right. Let me jump in
Thanks,
here.
Curtis.
Yeah, please do.
I'm all set then.
Thank you both. So the one thing that occurs to me is that if you have a standard that's acceptable for the particular use, I don't know that you can say it's not fully sprinkled, you know? So that's the part that jumps out at me is really drilling down in the definition of fully suppressed, because if they've met 100% of a code requirement, a code that applies to that building, then you know, one position is that we could argue it's fully suppressed, even if, as you said, you know, maybe we don't have attics or something like that. And that's what makes the question really kind of fun to drill into more. But we'll circle back on that. Let me just move on down the road. So actually, we can chat right over this if you want. If you want any follow-up. I presume that was Mark. I wasn't looking at who was talking to me.
It was me and then Curtis.
That's spices.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very
that was me responding to Mark's
Very
question.
good.
So
Well, we might
Thank
be
you, sir.
lucky here. The link isn't going to work. So, all right, you've probably all seen this video. If you haven't, feel free to send me an email and we'll get it to you. But it basically shows in this case that you've extinguished a fire in probably about 30 seconds, where it's a fully involved situation. There it is. I'm sorry. For some reason, I got duplicate slides on this, and I apologize. I weeded one out already. See, my Wi-Fi is really hauling here. See if I can do anything to accelerate that. Sometimes my little tablet is still tied to the hotspot in my car and that's what's going on, instead of the Wi-Fi in the building. So apologies. That's why everything's grinding so slow. I don't, if you folks didn't happen to hear, we lost a Lansing inspector, and now we have an injury on another inspector. I think at some point we really have to get on the state about looking for ways to make a little bit better pathways for for new inspectors. As you look around the room at our conferences, there's more 80-year-olds than 30-year-olds, and it's not a sustainable business model. No offense to us long in the tooth guys, but we need some youth in here. And even if we need a 50-year-old or what have you, Lansing had a problem, and Mike was the Lone Ranger for probably 8 months. Guys had to test and so forth, and it was really unfortunate, and it held up the hire of.
Yeah, you guys heard Mike passed away, right? Yep. Playback doesn't log in. Great. Gotta love Zooms.
I'm not doing it. I'm messed up enough. I don't need extra conversations. So it's outside, right? Up. outside.
Can't get the volume.
Lose it.
Okay. All right, everyone hear me or no?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. I apologize. I don't know if I dropped out on you. But we'll just proceed. And again, if I wasn't on when I said it, I apologize for my ill preparedness. I literally got off the road in time to talk to Rich and refill my coffee cup. Okay, so I was just saying that I don't remember whether it was last spring or the spring before, I did a presentation, another suppression presentation, and we asked who was using the 2010 NFPA 13. And a couple hands came out, and I asked why, but it was my feeling, since the 2015 Michigan Building Code directed you to the 2013 NFPA 13, it was folly to go to the 2010. Well, now we've got the inverse situation, right? We have the MBC hasn't been updated, so it's still directing us to the 2013, while the adopted mechanical code directs us to the 2019. So it is my feeling that the 19 is what we should use, and we have the pathway, right? We can go through the mechanical code and it references this. We have the intent of the state and the adoption of the 2021 mechanical code that directs us at this. So I would hope that everyone agrees that the 19 is the appropriate standard, but our adopted building code still addresses or directs you to the 2015 mechanical code. So someone could make a case that we should be on a different edition. But I'm taking it at face value that they adopted the 2021 mechanical code, so that's the mechanical code I use, and I'm going to use the standards that are referred to by that 2021 mechanical code, not the 2015 building code. And I think in every case, when we have a pathway to an updated code, it makes sense to use it. That's part of our administration talk, or rules and regs, or whatever they call it now. So as I mentioned before, since we skipped a cycle, we skipped the 2016 NFPA 13, so we want to look at that first. And this is all kind of, it's going to be a little bit dry. So again, I encourage anyone to jump in and chat when you like. We'll try to get a break here before the top of the hour to stretch and shake off the Z monster. The first thing I noticed was just in the administration in the 2016 code, the authors spent a lot of time re-explaining their measurements. And you're welcome to visit it if you like. I actually sort of gave you the Cliff's notes, but they spent a lot of real estate just to tell you that measurements aren't exact when they're doing conversions to meters square or whatever. We have an official definition of cloud ceilings now as well, in case anyone didn't know what they were. I'm sure everyone's seen them, so I say that tongue in cheek, but they're officially recognized now by the NFPA 13. The definition of small openings has changed a little bit, and I think it's kind of valuable information for us. So small openings implies something to me that's less than 8 square feet. But in the language in the 16 now, and subsequently in the 19, you're told that maybe an egg crate for a plenum ceiling or something like that can be a small opening. There's a good deal of other language talking about percentage of the ceiling and things, but I tell you where this came in handy for myself, and we have a very good fire marshal in East Lansing, John Newman, and we're looking at kind of a mechanical closet with duct room coming through, and to get a good joint between, a drop ceiling and this ductwork would have been very high drama. And with the language that allows us a percentage and everything that's available now, we were able to just call it close enough and move on down the road. And to me personally, and I don't know about you folks, but it makes a lot of sense. If the ceiling is largely closed, then you're going to trigger the sprinkler, and that's really what we want to have happen. If you have a bunch of holes around the sprinkler head itself, then you may delay response. But if one corner of the room has a couple of little gaps in the drop lid, it's not going to have any impact on the response of the sprinkler head. And so we don't necessarily need people to do acrobatics to plug up that last baby little hole. They also defined an extension fitting, which I sort of had a pretty good understanding of what that was before as well. So again, we're still in definitions. So CMDA sprinklers or control mode density area. I guess they didn't have a definition before. They deleted an available height for storage. They redefined solid shelf rack as a rack that is not defined as an open rack. I don't find that particularly handy either. Solid shelving, they kind of added a little more beef to that so that it's not necessarily just planks. It could be some things with some gaps that don't necessarily qualify as open anymore. Commodity classifications were altered a little bit, but again, this is going to be very specific to projects you're working on, and the same thing as rack storage language on changes. It's probably not going to come up very much. Just know that there have been changes, so don't assume you can keep going where you were. And there's just a figure on.
Hey, Joe, can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, what's up?
You're not sharing your slides anymore.
Oh, thank you.
And number two, I also have that home sprinkler video up on my other screen. If you want to share it, show it at some point, let me know.
Yeah, go for it, and I'll get my share opened up. I apologize. I got all this in front of me, but
I'll go ahead and share that now. Then.
You guys didn't care apparently to forget it. Yeah, please.
Yeah, apparently I got some buffering issues too, so
Okay.
I'll
Well,
stop sharing here.
Okay, I think most people have seen it.
All right. Let me see if I can
Honestly, folks, if you haven't given a class or written a show, if some of you haven't written a class or whatever yet, you have a minimum number of slides that the state wants to see to consider it X amount of hours of content. And so sometimes I'll confess to you privately, we just grab videos or whatever to fill time or fill slides. So, and it doesn't mean they're without value. It just It's just the nature of the beast, I guess, is the best way to say it. So I have to, can you see my slideshow now? Looks like I'm sharing.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
are.
we can see it, Joe.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right. I've got it in my own way now, so give me a moment to expand. I really apologize. I'm not doing a very good, smooth presentation today, but we'll get her rolling. Come on, slides. Trying to, so you're just here from current slide. There we go. All right. Now I need, okay, back on track. Sorry, folks. Yeah, different languages. We get into some of the commodities that, as I said, if you're into if you're drilling down over a particular project, it's worth looking to see if any of the polystyrenes and things like that that are specific to the job you're looking at have updated language, so you're not just going with the old stuff. But I honestly don't see that I can share anything with you in that regard today that's going to stick if 18 months from now you get that project. So, and I believe Rich or Sue will make this slideshow available as well, which is has some value if you are into those things to find the slide to direct you to the right section or the right language without having to flip through all the books. Because as I said, they rearranged the order of the content in the latest edition of the 13 that we're on. Again, there's more about Group A plastics and their definitions. Group B, unless somebody wants me to read each little line to you on those things, I don't think it's going to be useful. Non-metallic pipe listed for light hazard occupancies shall be permitted to be installed in ordinary hazard rooms of otherwise light hazard occupancies where the room does not exceed 400 square feet. So particularly this section, and this is worthwhile, is sort of directed at attached garages, maybe in some condos and things like that. So they've got a little bit of language change in there because we used to hold people to this 400 square foot rule, but they have some additional language in the coming up that lets you use the PVC and some little bit larger residential garages. Reducers and bushings are, I always thought self-explanatory. 7.1.5 though is of value. So air venting, a single air vent located near a high point on wet systems utilizing metallic pipe is now required. So you don't have to do it from multiple parts, but it's it was a theory of the authors that if we are able to push that air out, that we can reduce some of the corrosion in a system. And I just wanted to point out a couple things. So it says located near a high point. So we don't necessarily need a guy to do acrobatics to hit the very highest point on the system, but we need it somewhere in the vicinity, elevation wise, I guess is the best way to put it. So air vents on essentially every new system, if there's metallic pipe, is a must. And that's one of the bigger changes that will apply to pretty much every system you look at. Okay, and it allows you to use an automatic air vent or an inspector's test. It's something that we can vent air through. It didn't dictate what specifically, just that we need to have one. And what I always like to say is when people ask me what I want, I tell them I don't want to limit them to my imagination. So the book gives a levity. If they have a new product that comes out that's listed and labeled and gets rid of the air, that's fine. If they want to use an old ball valve with a you know, a plug in it with an inspector's test sign on it, that's fine too, and anything in between. I don't know if this will play, we can check, but this just drilled down a little bit more into air vents. And I'm not going to get it, and we're not going to try. Okay, and this is a little bit newer as well, and there's some language here specifically. I'm sure you've all been in that hotel or apartment building where if you wanted to turn off one floor, you had to turn off every floor. And that's, you know, you think about it from the service side, and what a nightmare to shut everything and drain everything down to service a head on 4. So now they need control valve assemblies on any building exceeding 2 stories in height, with their control valve, check valve, main drain valve, flow switch, and so forth for isolation for each individual floor level. But they do have the exception that if it's a floor level that's served by the floor below, which you see a lot in wood construction, they just go ahead and, you know, put a sidewall on this wall and then go up 1 floor and put another sidewall. That doesn't necessarily need the isolation. But if you've got a little bit larger building and they're running standpipes and they're coming off at every floor, they definitely need some isolation between the floors. So 8241 is a good one to drill down into a little bit more. If you have these hotels like Mark, or you know, an apartment building or something like that, then it may apply in your case where it didn't before. Come on, switch. So, and it doesn't apply to dry systems and so forth. Okay, so now they expanded the heads that we're allowed to use in light hazards. So your control mode and your early suppression heads can be used in lights, and in fact they're kind of dictated in some cases that are coming up. So requires if quick sprinklers are installed that all sprinklers in a compartment be quick response unless permitted. You can do it where there's no quick response sprinklers in the temperature range required. There's an NRAC exception. Recognizes and permits multi-listed sprinklers, which may or may not have come up for you folks yet. There's a couple different styles. And permits extended coverage sprinkler to protect under an overhead door is there. And there's some, that's a case where I was mentioning that it's almost required. And we'll hit on that in a minute. Pre-action dry pipe systems, you do not automatically have to have galvanized pipe anymore. It doesn't say they can't use it, but it was taken out as a specific requirement. We've got same language about obstructions over 4 feet in width. But when we do protect under some of those, and the most common thing I'm thinking of is you know, an HVAC situation. When you are protecting under those, the sprinkler shall be not more than 3 inches from the outside edge of the obstruction. So it doesn't necessarily have to pop up right in the middle of it. It can kind of be off to the side. And where they're adjacent to the obstruction, they shall be of intermediate level rack type to protect it from the discharge of the overhead sprinklers, okay? So if we're not centering it under the obstruction, we need to use the correct type of sprinkler head so that its response isn't delayed by water from overhead. Make sense to everybody? And they shall not be more than 12 inches below the obstruction. They're not required where the obstruction is not more than 24 inches above the floor or deck. So if this obstruction is large, kind of like a desk, you know, it could be immovable, but if it's not more than 24 inches above the floor deck, then we don't necessarily need a sprinkler under it. There can be other triggers, but not automatically just because of the width of the short side. And then the sprinklers should be of the same type except for the part I mentioned before, where if they're within the spray pattern of the sprinklers above, they have to have some built-in overhead protection. Okay, this is another one that's a little bit new. So when you're installing a sprinkler under a skylight, not exceeding 32 square feet, your distance from the ceiling shall be measured or your distance to the lid of the skylight can be measured to the plane of the ceiling. It doesn't mean that they have to, that they can't have it higher up in the skylight, but they can just have it kind of along the ceiling plane with other uprights or whatever in the room. So that's a little bit of a change, because this could conceivably put you a few feet from the top of the skylight that may collect heat or whatever, but it's allowable now. And then they've got some language on how you're going to measure your attic width and sprinkler spacing. And we do have they've got some new diagrams on your placement under hip roofs and things like that, just to add clarity to some of the old code. So that's in your commentary 864143 in that area, if you want to look a little more deeply into it. But the hip roof is kind of important. Rather, it's kind of helpful because it has come up a little bit for us lately. When we get into the minimum distance from obstructions, this is where you're going to see some alternative sprinkler heads allowed in certain cases. I'm just having a look here. It's about 1:45. You all want to take about 10 or so, and I'll see if I can do something with this light bulb behind me that's giving me a disco show.
Sure.
Sound good? We'll see you back about a couple minutes before the hour. I got rid of the disco ball, so you're welcome for that. I appreciate everyone putting up with me. It's not my best work so far today, but we'll see if we can improve on it. The next section here, the 865213, talks about obstructions, and they deleted a little bit of language as far as the maximum cleared distance being 24 inches. And they just kind of refined that a little bit more. So they're talking about horizontal orientation shall be 24 inches max still, but you cannot apply that to obstructions that are vertical. So if it's a pillar or something like that, then the 24-inch max rule does not necessarily apply. So watch that. It's kind of a subtle change, and usually our guys will just work kitty corner around a column or whatever anyway to cover all sides. But if you were using the 3-time rule or whatever in reference to a pillar, you may not have been in the right place. Okay, and they really drilled down into soffits and things like that, and these are a little bit new, and I'm going to be disappointed in this case if I can't activate the video, because the presenter on that had a much better description than I did, but maybe we can get you all the link to it. So it talks about the geometry of soffits and cupboards and how you have to protect around those. And we can go through the language, but I think the picture is worth 1,000 words in this case. So let me get you up to this photo in particular does a pretty good job, I think, of so you can have a sidewall, for instance, over the top of a cupboard, providing you meet this geometry. You can have one in a soffit, perhaps, that doesn't protect underneath it, as long as the soffit is only 8 inches wide. So those are a little bit new, a little bit different, and they add clarity. I don't know that in most cases, if we've got that kind of soffit, you're probably 13R anyway, and probably not that uptight about 8 inches, but now you've got something to hang your hat on. And then spraying obstructions against the walls is the video. Let's see if we get lucky here. I think this has some value. It's about 7 minutes long.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This video is on NFPA 13's soffit and cabinet rule.
He might be East
Spraying
Coast.
under obstructions located against a wall. Let's get started. The soffit rule identifies whether or not we need sprinkler heads under the obstruction located against the wall, or if we can use its formula to locate the sprinkler head for its spray pattern to extend under the obstruction. This is not limited to only soffits. Ductwork, cable trays, or other similar projections attached to the wall can also be used for this rule. And we will also cover the cabinet rule. When do we not need sprinkler heads under cabinets? Before we get into the details, everything we go over in this video is specific to these style heads only. So make sure if you're going to apply the rules we go over today, it's for the right heads that are in this shot. All right, here it is. Let's break this down piece by piece. Distance A, the distance from the side of the obstruction to the center of the sprinkler head. Distance B is the distance from the bottom of the obstruction to the deflector. And distance D is the width of the obstruction. If we are going to use the soffit rule for one of the available sidewalls, it is for obstructions against a wall located on the same wall as the sprinkler. This is not to spray under obstructions across from the sidewall. So make sure we got that right. If you're trying to spray under an obstruction located on the opposite side of the sidewall, we're going to use the beam rule for that specific head. Okay, now on to the formula. First thing we have to make sure is that it is 30 inches or less. If the width of the obstruction is 30 inches or less, we always minus 8 inches first. Then we add the distance from the bottom of the obstruction to the sprinkler deflector. We add those together, and that will give us A, the distance from the side of the obstruction to the center of the sprinkler head. This is always the same for all the available heads that we can use. All right, I created an example so we can run this through with some realistic numbers we're going to see out in the field. D, 30 inches, the width of the obstruction. In B, the distance from the bottom of the obstruction to the sprinkler deflector is 12 inches. First thing we'll do is take D, 30 inches, and minus 8, always. That's going to give us 22 inches. Then we're going to add 12 inches to the 22. That's going to give us 34 inches. And that is how far from the side of the obstruction to the center of the sprinkler head we have to be to achieve a full spray pattern underneath our obstruction. All right, if the soffit rule is not an option, maybe pushing the sprinkler head further off the side of the obstruction puts us too close to another sprinkler head, or maybe the obstruction is over 30 inches. In that case, we put a head underneath the obstruction. Or you can always try to use the beam rule to spray under the obstruction, keeping in mind the max distance from the wall behind the obstruction to the center of the sprinkler head has to be half the max distance depending on the head you're using and the hazard occupancy you are in. The intent of the soffit rule is to apply to soffits or obstructions that are located within the 18-inch plane from the sprinkler deflector. A soffit or other obstruction, like a shelf, for example, located against a wall that is located entirely below the 18-inch plane from the sprinkler deflector should be in accordance with sprinklers being placed under obstructions over 4 feet wide. So if you run into this situation where you have a shelf or a soffit or ductwork located against the wall that is below the 18-inch plane from the sprinkler deflector, then you just treat that as an obstruction less than 4 feet wide. There's going to be enough water covering the area to get your satisfactory performance, and nothing else is needed. If that obstruction ends up being over 4 feet wide, then we're going to have to add a head underneath to cover accordingly. If the obstruction, like the shelf we're talking about, is within the 18-inch plane of the sprinkler deflector, then we're going to try to locate that sprinkler using the soffit or the beam rule so we can spray underneath it. Or we can add the head underneath to get our full coverage. Okay, now to finish off the video with the cabinet rule. Obstructions located against the wall that are not over 24 inches in width shall be protected in accordance with our figure. The maximum distance between the sprinkler and the wall shall be measured from the center of the sprinkler to the wall behind the obstruction and not the face of the obstruction. So what do we have to keep in mind? The maximum distance between sprinklers depends on the style head we are using. That's going to give us our max distance off the wall, and the hazard occupancy we are in to make sure we're spacing the heads correctly and getting the correct maximum distance off the wall. So the other big thing is there is no maximum distance from the fire sprinkler deflector to the bottom of the obstruction. No maximum. So if our obstruction is 24 inches or less, and we keep in mind our max distance from the wall behind the obstruction to the center of the sprinkler head, we can omit the head under that cabinet. All right, everyone. As always, I hope you learned something new, and I'll catch you on the next video.
Okay, well, going back to this, he didn't address this particular scenario where you have a sidewall on the same side as the cabinets, but he did get deeper into the language previous to that. So I think, as I said, a picture is worth 1,000 words on that one. A little bit of a strong East Coast accent, but pretty good illustration, I think. And there is a little bit of new content there versus the 2013. So worth having. Let me fight through my slideshow here. Okay, and the next section that we had here, there's a lot of language still about attic sprinklers. There's more of the soffit information. Isolated obstructions are identified, projecting from the same wall as the one which the sidewall sprinkler is mounted on. That's that language kind of by the cupboards. This actually drops it to 6-inch in this scenario. So yeah, I don't want to read everything line by line to you folks, but a little bit of new language there, a little bit of, if you have an obstruction question or whatever, a little bit of new stuff to drill down into. I think almost in every case, this language will be less stringent than before. So if the contractor hasn't educated themselves and they just do it to the old, the 13 edition, why there's no penalty for overachieving, right? Now we're talking a little bit more about columns. And remember, we took away the max distance on that. So you got to watch your geometry. And there's some tables here. And as I said, hopefully we'll be able to make this slideshow available to everyone so you can look through some of those numbers, but I don't see any retention or value to just reading each line individually. So residential sprinklers are not permitted to be used on ceilings with slopes greater than 812 or ceilings with heights greater than 24 feet unless specifically listed for that purpose. So that was reported as new language, but I think probably everyone already checked to make sure that a sprinkler was appropriate for an application and some of those a little bit less usual circumstances. Okay, and then if you're installing under one of those greater pitches with the appropriate sprinkler head, you don't have to cock the sprinklers. You know, you've seen the fellas that put the deflector at an angle or whatever. That's not necessarily required, so bear that in mind if you run across it. Continuous obstructions below an ESFR are identified here, some of the new language, and it's all very similar. 3 times rules and things like that. And I don't want to bore you with repetition. Hopefully it felt like that video helped kind of illustrate the cupboards rules to you and things like that. Anyone have a specific question that we need to dig down into a little bit more? Okay, because here's a new one. Cases where sprinklers aren't required above clouds. So I'll tell you in a nutshell, a lot of the language is similar to, you know, the small openings in ceilings rule or what have you. But so you get into the percent of the ceiling that's obstructed by this cloud and what's going on, you know, as far as any openings in the cloud and things like that. But I would say, at least for my purposes, my mindset is if you have a ceiling in a building that's fully suppressed again, and you have a cloud in the middle of that ceiling and you're protected under the cloud, I don't know necessarily, except because it wasn't clarified before, that sprinklers above that cloud aren't going to be redundant. And I say that because you're going to trigger the ones on the cloud first, right? And then if we do start to get around the cloud up to the ceiling, we're going to trigger all the adjacent ones. So you've already got a waterfall around it. I don't know what a sprinkler head over a cloud in the middle of a room is going to add to the conversation. And that's what appears to be the intent here, is to get rid of a little bit of redundancy. But there are specific requirements on that. And again, worst case scenario, if your contractor didn't take the time to educate themselves on the changes, they're just going to do it as they have been with over-unders, and they're going to be overachieving, and that's never a problem, right? So just know that it's there in case they don't protect over the cloud, that they might not have to. So, and here's some of the additional language to it. So if you felt like you want to drill down into it more, you're at 815 is where you're going to want to look. Now, this is a new one, Mark, and it may apply to your hotel, even if they're fully suppressed or go that way. They got rid of the 3-foot rule for closets. So now, as long as you don't interfere with that or exceed that 24 square foot on the closet, it doesn't matter if the short side is more than 3 feet deep. And that is a change. And I you know, I always kind of wondered about that rule anyway, so I wasn't shocked to see that taken out of here. But and for those of you who may just have a niggling memory, it used to be, particularly you'd see it in apartments, some closets were sprinkled, some weren't, and if you asked, they'd tell you, well, that's deeper than 3 feet, and that's why we had to put a sprinkler head in this one, but that one isn't deeper than 3 feet or whatever, so we didn't. So that 3 foot on the short side rule was what triggered the sprinkler heads before in some closets where others didn't have it, but that has been removed. But it can't exceed 24 square feet in that closet. Exempts revolving door enclosures from protection. And then you've got some language that clarifies main drain test connections. This is another new one that's kind of interesting to me, and I like it, but they now want electronic supervision of heat tracing system were used so that we know that it's energized. And that makes sense. If you're using heat trace to keep your pipe from freezing, you probably want a heads up if that fails. So, you know, it's up to the engineers to decide how to do that, but just a current monitor or something like that would be a fairly simple solution in that case. But I can see a scenario where a heat tape quits and nobody knows about it because you don't check that stuff all the time. And in this case, you'd get a supervisory on the panel or something to let you know. Okay. Switched before I wanted to, now it won't switch. Okay. Real quick, if you're not familiar with heat tracing, this is a 1-minute video, so good time for a cup of coffee.
Heat tracing is a system used to maintain the temperature of pipes, vessels, and surfaces. In heat tracing, an electrical heating element is fitted in physical contact along a length of pipe or across a surface. Heat generated by the element maintains the temperature of the surface. Typically, the pipe or surface is covered with insulation to retain heat loss. A robust heat tracing system often includes a thermostat, monitor, and controller so that end users can track and adjust the temperature of the heated surface. Heat tracing is commonly used to prevent pipes from freezing, to maintain the temperature and flow of transported substances, and heat floors, driveways, and parking lots. Stay tuned to Galco TV for more tech tips. And
So I'm sure we don't have to tell you, but of course, whenever you use it with fire, it has to be listed and labeled for use with fire. So sorry, Galco, appreciate the video, but you're not a fire approved heat trace. So I'm sure you all know to just make sure it's listed and labeled for fire suppression system use. And it's a good solution a lot of times in stairwells, for instance. We had one recently where we noticed they didn't have any heat in the stairwell. This was an existing building. Fire marshal happened to be there on an inspection with me, and it's like, yeah, you gotta protect this from freezing in case somebody props the back door open on a cold day while they're moving or whatever. So heat trace was a perfect solution in that case versus you know, they just had to install an outlet versus you know, try to pull over heavy enough wire for electric heaters or what have you. And that predated this monitored language, so they didn't have to jump through that hoop. As I said, the storage changes, this is chapter 16 through 21. There's many changes in there, and to go through each one would be laborious and excruciating, frankly. So if you're not looking at a rack system or some sort of storage setup, you don't need to use that to cure your insomnia. The room design method now has includes communicating spaces, so you've got a little bit of language change and calculation methods. An air test on dry systems is now a 40 psi test for 2 hours, and the system may not lose more than 3 psi. So we used to have them pump it up and make sure the gauge didn't move. Now there's an understanding of the things in place. That loss isn't totally uncommon, but doesn't mean it's going to be a big problem. So this changes the test requirements and the length of the test. So you do want to be familiar with that, so you're not dictating an older, longer test or higher PSI or holding them to a zero loss standard when 3 is allowable. There's an alternative test in that same paragraph there, and that's 25-2211 for anyone keeping score at home. You can actually just disconnect the air source if we have, say, a system where they skip the test earlier on. And if the alarm doesn't sound within 4 hours, then they pass that air test on their dry system. General information sign must now include the location of venting valve. We talked about the air vent that's required now, so we have to identify where that is. And also results of dry pipe and double interlock pre-action valve tests. Where are we at time-wise? Let's refresh our memory on dry pipe operation real quick. If it works, if it doesn't, you're saved. Maybe it's on a subsequent slide. Nope, no video for you. Okay, that with the exception of the storage stuff that I told you is laborious, the biggest changes are that test method on your dry pipe, getting rid of the 3-foot rule on the short side of a closet that does not exceed 24 square feet, the suppression over a cloud system, a little bit different language on protection geometry if you have sidewalls over soffits or cupboards. That is most of the meat of it. And the air vent, of course. So and there's 8,000 different things. Like I said, there's a little bit of minor changes to definitions and so forth. And of course, you notice whenever they try to clarify, you often go away more confused. So just knowing those couple of things is of value, I think, and for your day-to-day sprinkler systems you're working with. So when you look at the origin and development of the 2019 edition, their choice of words is that they set out to arrange things more in the order of the designer as they go through the design of the system. And maybe it is better, I don't know. Most of us guys with gray in our beards don't really like dramatic changes like that because it just makes the hunt harder and taxes our failing memories. But fortunately, we have Google, so we ought to be able to find it in there. So in the new book, there is a roadmap provided to kind of help you sort out where stuff is now. And I believe I have an example of that. So, and this is just a portion of it, but your roadmap would say if you were in the 16, everything's in a similar place to the 13. So if you know you were looking for something around 6613, the roadmap will tell you it's now 16932. Especially if you're like Mark Riley and you remember most of the numbers off the top of your head, this is really going to jerk you around. But for most of the rest of us that always have to look it up, it may not be as laborious. So looking at the table of contents now, I mean, again, I'm not going to read you every line, but it just, it's dramatically increased in content as far as, because of the way they arranged this thing. And in fairness, I mean, in the old system, one of the things was we had a chapter that was just sort of a bucket of spare parts that had a lot of things dumped into it, and it didn't make it as easy to find what we were looking for. As far as specific changes, and this is one I kind of enforced before, so I guess I was ignorant and didn't know that it wasn't required already. But now if you have a required air compressor, it shall be hardwired with an approved disconnect. So I'm sure you've all seen where they run down to depot and grab a pancake or a little roller compressor or whatever. And that doesn't fly in the 2019 edition. And then pre-action or deluge valve shall be electronically supervised. And again, they tell me that's new. I'd already enforced it. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to, so shame on me. So hardwired compressors can't be plugged in the wall, can't be, the disconnect can't be a light switch. And here's about a minute and a half on hard compressors, if it works. Try one more time and we'll move along. Oh, looks like it might want to start.
Something that's new in 13, the 2019 edition, and we're really glad that this is now in there, that you cannot use an air compressor that has a disconnecting means by way of a light switch or a plug-in cord. So if you are, plugging in an air compressor and it goes to a light switch, that is not allowed. Or your customer is. If you have a, just wired directly to anything that has the light switch. A light switch can only handle about, I think it's 10 amps to 12 amps, the standard use light switch. So that's something that you want to keep in mind because, even a small air compressor is going to spike high on amperage when it starts up. And again, in this application, it's going to start up a lot. It's going to start up a couple times a day as the system starts to leak. So it's going to be seeing high amps a lot. So you have some real electrical issues there. And then the plug-in cord, it's just too easy to remove. It's too easy. People shut these things off in these rooms all the time. And then you get low air alarms and things like that. So there's a large variety of reasons why this is a great idea.
So I agree it's a great idea. In fact, I'd already wrongfully enforced it. So shame on me. But, I always tell my, the contractors before me, if they have different language, that they're always welcome to present it. I'm never afraid to be challenged because I don't know everything any more than any of us do. So you're allowed residential pendants or uprights to be installed under beamed or beamed and sloped ceilings now where all of the following apply. Beam can't be 14 inches. Ceiling height does not exceed 24. Requires pendants installed under or adjacent beams to have a deflector so that one doesn't cross weld another. Allows concealed sprinkler installation in beams not more than 4 inches in depth. So we all remember the old scene where they have sort of a decorative beam ceiling and all of a sudden you have to have a pendant on either side of it because you weren't allowed to put the pendant under the beam and you had to cover both sides of the beam or whatever. So this section right here, it gives the designers a little more levity, maybe to clean up the sprinkler heads in those scenarios. Okay, and I mentioned the garages now. So allowing CPVC in some residential garages within a dwelling unit, not an apartment building, right? And not exceeding 1,000 square feet. So I kind of pointed out before we had that 400-foot rule, and in a lot of cases, you'd have a garage larger than that. And even though the whole house was done in CPVC, people were switching back to the steel pipe because that garage was maybe 600 square feet or what have you. Now they can continue on with the CPVC as long as the garage is not more than 1,000 square feet. So essentially the garage becomes an accessory to the dwelling rather than a separate occupancy or greater hazard. Automatic indicating valves are now allowed. They must be supervised and capable of manual operation. we've got some different allowances in the design. So for your inside hose allowance and such. So again, if you're getting into a design review on a larger project or whatever, and they offer you a hose allowance that doesn't seem to be quite enough, you'll want to revisit this particular section, and you might find that it's allowable now where it wasn't before. And cavities and unsprinklered wall spaces from area of coverage. So before, as we did the design, you basically had to do it based on the square footage in the building, the space between your layers of drywall or whatever was calculated into the hydrocalc load. Now you don't have to factor in that space, and that can be quite significant in a large building with a lot of partitions. You could have, hundreds of square feet, if not more, of, basically unprotected space between the studs, between the wall board. We don't have to calculate that in now or make allowance for it in our water supply. Okay, yeah, if you don't know, a CMSA produces large droplets at low pressures to better suppress fires and control some more challenging hazards, right? So the changes in tables 22.2 through 22.5 recognize the capability of those sprinkler heads and gives you a little bit less stringent demands. Okay, and more about the in-racks and rack storage. And again, I don't know about you folks, but if I get an in-rack storage system, it's going to be the first I've seen in years, and I'm going to have to revisit the book anyway. That's why I just don't suggest that we spend too much time on that. There's language added for now the bigger K-factor sprinkler heads that are available. And if you haven't seen it at work, there was a video on ESFR sprinklers. I think I showed that at my last class, and I don't think we have to visit it today unless somebody really wants to see it. Okay, and we have a boilerplate for what's required on the design, and they added a couple of things. So zones of influence used in calculations for seismic bracing need to be indicated on the plans if you guys move to California. Name, address, and phone number of contractor. I, again, must have overimposed that. I didn't know it wasn't there, but they tell me it's new. Ceiling roof heights and slopes not shown in full height cross section. Make type, model, size of backflow prevention assembly, and means to forward flow test at system demand. Okay, so we'll just put this on here. So what we're getting into now is items not covered. Has anyone run across these pods yet that they want to put in offices? Have you seen them?
Yeah, I've seen them before.
Okay.
You talking about the phone booths?
Well, they're bigger than phone booths, but yeah, I mean, they might be 2, 4, 6 passenger, you're old enough, Mark. I always refer to them as the cone of silence from the old Get Smart show. So
Exactly, that's what they were for. For workers to be able to take their cell phone and go in there and have a private conversation.
yeah, some of them are just like a one passenger kind of thing. This is if you haven't seen them, these are going to start popping up. So it's basically a cubicle within an office building.
The problem we had with was not so much the fire suppression, but they had no means of ventilation into these units.
Right. Right, so they just put this box in the middle of things, and as Mark points out, and some of them are getting very sophisticated. Some actually have a little local sprinkler head to them. Some have ventilation systems built in. They have places to tie in. Alarm notification is another thing, Mark, right? If we're trying to keep noise from penetrating these walls, then suddenly you may not have your sound pressure for your notification devices. So not all of that is our concern per se. If you're building it, it certainly is. But in the context of suppression, the biggest thing is how do we address the fact that we've just put, a dry spot in the middle of a fully suppressed building, if that's the case. So, it's going to keep the rain out in many circumstances. So there's a lot of different things. They have some that are designed with open roofs, so they're not really a sprinkler problem. As I said, there's some now that have, a self-contained suppression head in there. And there's always more than one way to skin the cat. So, I always say I don't care what path you take. I just need something that I can recognize as compliant. So, and I'll pick on you again, Mark, since you're the only one who talks to me, but so where do you get your language to deal with pods? It's not in the 13. It's not in the 2019 or the 16 or the 1313.
Well, I think it goes back to areas that need to be suppressed. We had not to try to go on another rabbit hole here, but we had a car manufacturing company that was building completely enclosed Weldon booths, and they had an exhaust in there. And in those Weldon booths, there was no sprinkler system. So the fire marshal came across it, and in the same building, they had to shut off half the sprinkler system too. But he made him go back and put some sort of fire suppression in these totally enclosed Weldon booths. And it would be similar to almost these pods.
Well, and yeah, I don't disagree, but one of the things that, and I got this from a state attorney years ago, probably going back to the early 20s, but trying to jump to the next slide, so forgive me for the noise. We don't want you, we want next slide. There we go. So coincidentally, we researched this for a project in East Lansing. Actually, the MSU Federal Credit Union, and if anything starts with green and white, we have to be a little bit deferent as long as we keep them safe. But we're open-minded. So so you do have the authority in 104.1 of your mechanical code to render interpretations, and you also have the authority to consider alternative materials, designs, methods, constructions, and so forth, right? So we don't have to automatically discard it because it's not fitting in a box in our book. But we always want a pathway. We always want to support our decision to accept something that's coloring outside the lines a little bit. And what I said I heard from the state attorney once upon a time was that, if there's a subsequent code edition that's not adopted yet, you may use language out of that, providing it's not more stringent. So whenever we adopt, in 2030 or whatever, the next mechanical code, it should point us at the 2022 NFPA 13, and there we find 9210 has small temporarily occupied enclosures. And it's about phone booths, as you said, Mark, but also about these pods. So it tells us that we don't necessarily have to beef up the suppression. We don't have to necessarily consider it an obstruction to the overhead suppression or whatever under certain circumstances. And so it's kind of like the closet rule, shall not exceed 24 square feet. And you can't store stuff in there. They shall not extend to the ceiling. So there's actually a definition of these things in the NICS code coming up, and parameters. So we determined, myself, and as I said, we have a very good fire marshal, that these were acceptable as long as we colored within these lines. They couldn't go out and get a 40 square footer or a 30 square footer without actually putting in some sort of suppression. And then the building inspector and the electrical inspector would have to make their own determinations regarding notification. And as I said, some of these actually have open lids on them. So suppression would already be there with an overhead system, and notification shouldn't be impeded. And ventilation wouldn't necessarily be a problem. So there's a bunch of different types of them. Look them up. When you see them, remember that you can look to subsequent edition of the codes and weigh in those requirements and see if it agrees with the picture you have in your head. No one can make you accept it, of course, but if it's there, if it's wasn't thought of before and they have guidelines, why not consider it very heavily in a decision you make to accept something that's not in your current edition of the code, right? But we all see our job how we see it. So we have a reference from a known standard in this case. We have the authority to, interpret, and we have the authority to consider alternative methods or materials. And all those things come right from different sections of the book. So when you do accept something that's not specifically laid out in your current edition of the code, it is worth compiling that pathway, starting in the administrative of the mechanical code and working all the way through to the section of the unadopted code that you're using as guidelines, and just attaching it to the permit record. So if your feet are ever held to the fire, no pun intended, you can show how you arrived there. So we don't expect you to remember everything that's here. Hopefully we'll make the slideshow available. The biggest things are I don't know if it's coming up. It comes up a lot in Ann Arbor, I know, or it did for me, where you had attached garages on these condos, and they might be 2-car. And now they don't have to automatically switch to steel pipe as long as they stay under that 1,000 square feet. And as long as we're under 24, we don't have to sprinkle a closet. We do want an air vent on every system. Remember, steel pipe's the trigger for that air vent. If it's all CPVC, then we're not worried about corrosion, right? So it's not a thing in that case. And then if you ever have something that's beating you or taking you off the beaten path as far as materials or whatever, look through subsequent editions and see if you find language there. As far as I'm concerned, Google is the most powerful tool that has been granted to inspectors since I started in the business.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
When you're using CPVC systems, shouldn't there be a concern if it's partially steel piping and upstream from the CPVC? Aren't we concerned about what type of cut and oil is being used for the steel pipe so we do not contaminate or cause corrosion on the CPVC?
Yeah, I worry about a lot of that. I worry about in old unvented systems, if we're going to get a little chunk of rust, it'll plug up a head down the line and everything. But
this is the oil, the cut and oil they use in the steel.
Sure.
I'm always leery of anything with like a mineral spirits in it or something.
As far as attacking the CPVC itself?
Yes, I mean, there is a list of the 2 manufacturers of the material, what can't touch it. And then, well, what about the internal pipe though? And if you have steel pipe and you go ahead and run water through, maybe some of that cut and oil will get into the CPVC.
I don't think that's an unrealistic concern. So have you, are you making people kind of pre-flush the steel section of the pipe before the CPVC's on, or are you just spitballing here?
No, there is one cut and oil that can be used with no problem, not from my understanding, from the manufacturer, and that is like a cotton seed oil as far as that goes, because I always question when they first get on a job. I ask the sprinkler contractor, what are they using for their cut and oil, and most sprinkler contractors are worth their weight in gold are aware of this.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And fortunately, that's I think more of the sprinkler fitters I see than not are pretty serious and competent in their jobs. Yeah, that's an interesting point that I haven't really looked at, but that's why I like having you in the room, Mark. You you spark ideas. So um, I guess one of the other things I didn't really touch on here, and there is um, language coming up again also about antifreeze systems. So it didn't quite get to us in the 2019, but in 2022. So you can look for your guidance there. If you folks don't know, they had basically an expiration date where folks were supposed to just do away with antifreeze systems. But was it 20 or 21, Mark? It escapes me now. I think 21 maybe. Um, since then, they've come up with listed antifreezes that are permissible and even guidelines to be able to continue to use what you have. And that's if you're testing it for concentration of, depending on the type of antifreeze used. So there's pathways. If you run across a antifreeze system, you should make sure that it's tested by a competent guy and that they've either flushed it out and replaced it with listed antifreeze or tested the antifreeze for the required concentrations. And I literally on Lake Lansing Road in East Lansing was in the mire one day and looked on the wall, and they had a dry pipe system going out, or an antifreeze system going out kind of to the garden area, and there was a tag hanging right on it on the sales floor that it failed and they needed to address it, and the tag was a couple years old. So I took a picture and sent it to John Newman, the fire marshal, and I think they're getting it attended to now. But yeah, in those cases, go ahead.
Just, and this is a little bit offshoot, but when I worked at Kmart World Headquarters, our chill water coils, we would flush with antifreeze. And what happened was the antifreeze with air would be very corrosive, and we started getting chill water coil failures. So the company that sold the antifreeze told us that we needed to fully fill the coils with antifreeze and not leave any air in there, because the air reacted with the antifreeze and attacked the material on the coils. So I wonder if that would be the same thing in piping systems.
Yeah, interesting point. And I haven't seen one of these flushed, so I don't know that they're just draining it and refilling it, but it would.
But you're right, there is a concern about antifreeze. I noticed several articles concerning antifreeze being used in sprinkler systems.
Oh yeah, I had videos at the last class I gave for the review on this, and basically, if you folks don't know, if their concentration gets too high, you're looking at, maybe an ethyl-based antifreeze, then it becomes an accelerant. And that's really not our hope for a suppression system, right? Is to hose it with gasoline. And there were some deaths because of that. So, but the listed antifreezes, and there's about 3 brands out there, and of course they're priced proudly, but they ensure that the concentration does not exceed the allowable limits. The upcoming additions do allow measurement of existing systems and the continued use without changing that antifreeze or brine, I should say, the mix of antifreeze and water, providing it's within the allowable limits. So you're not going to get all that information yet from the 2019. So it's my feeling, but yours to judge, that it's okay to look for guidance out of the 22 or the 24. I think some of the language isn't fully developed yet. So, but yeah, and it's worth looking around. If you're in that Myers or whatever and you see suppression hanging on the wall, you guys are probably like me, where your wives are smacking you for working while you're off. But, I see an expired tag or a red tag from a suppression company on a sprinkler pipe. I want to know what the heck it says. And, as I looked at it, I found for 2 years, they've been ignoring the advice of their sprinkler fitters to deal with that. So, and as I said, there were literal deaths where people who were in the spray of poorly mixed antifreeze were incinerated. So, not especially cool. And you may not even know what you have for antifreeze systems in your community. Hopefully, you all have a good relationship with your fire marshal, and hopefully, you have the blessing of an active and educated fire marshal. But if not, just keep your eyes peeled. And we have plenty of resources in our book to impose it ourselves if we don't have a fire marshal that'll take up the banner for us. You've got language in your admin of the mechanical code that says dangerous or unsafe systems you can address. You can order disconnection of utilities, right? You can also order correction of an antifreeze-based suppression system that hasn't been taken care of. So, which, by the way, I shy away from as much as possible. I don't care to write tickets. I don't care to, I prefer cooperation in every case. And just explain to them what's going on, the risks, and hopefully they decide they want to deal with it. And then just keep your documents, date of order, and so forth. Okay. I don't know that you guys want to go through a quiz. Anyone got any questions on anything? It's my feeling that there's probably maybe a dozen changes between these two. Well, really a couple past editions of the code that will really impact your day-to-day in your fire suppression, which of course may not be day-to-day. As long as you know those handfuls of things, you should probably be in pretty good shape. But as always, it's up to where so many of these are making the standard less stringent, it's up to the contractor to educate himself. It's not incumbent upon us to tell him he didn't have to do that anymore. And I offer to send them my list of the most commonly impacted items for change that I came up with when I wrote this, and they're welcome to read it or ignore me and keep sprinkling closets that are less than 24 square feet if they want. It doesn't make the system less. Nobody got nothing? Well, how about a terminal break? We're coming up on the hour. I don't have another hour of content for you without being in a room with you and a little more interaction. So if you do get the PowerPoint from Sue, there's some questions and answers at the end. If you work your way through those and kind of the PowerPoint backwards, it's also a resource to help you find some of the changes, because I did try to highlight those changes. So for instance, the small openings are your question 2. Venting system. So this little quiz that I put at the end of this thing is going to touch on the things that I think will be the most common changes that you'll see in your usual sprinkler inspections. Anyone got anything to add? Rich, I can't squeak another hour out of this. Sorry, bud.